All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today you will discover SD Elements, a breakthrough solution that enables organizations to scale threat modeling across their software portfolios and release secure products faster. Today you will see a live demonstration of threat modeling in SD Elements and learn how to rapidly identify weaknesses that threats target, provide developers actionable guidance to mitigate threats, build secure cloud applications, APIs, and microservices, and simplify complex regulations and compliances. Before I introduce you all to our speaker, let's quickly go through some housekeeping items. A recording of this webinar will be available after today's event. You will receive an email with the link to the recording, and we will also be publishing the recording in the resources section of our website. Also, we encourage everyone to raise questions. Please submit your questions into the Q&A box and we will address them during our Q&A session at the end. Lastly, if you would like to follow up with us or if you have a topic you'd like to see covered in a future webinar, please email us at contact@securitycompass.com. Now let's get to know today's speaker, Adhiran Thirmal, Senior Solutions Engineer at Security Compass. Adhiran is a seasoned application security engineer with 8 years of experience in cloud services, business analytics, and telecommunications. He is an outdoor enthusiast. Adhiran loves spending time on the mountains or sandy beaches around Vancouver, BC. He is way too knowledgeable about coffee, as one can be in the Pacific Northwest. Adhiran, you can take it from here.
Thank you so much. I'm actually just going to hand it over to Eleanor here for a quick sec just to get started. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much, Eleanor. So in terms of threat modeling itself, it's really interesting. Like there's ultimately a number of different challenges that come into play. And ultimately threat modeling itself is a very complex endeavor. Ultimately, you have to, through threat modeling itself, you have to, analyze your components, be able to identify threats, and then ultimately be able to influence developers and teams to be able to not only take mitigations from the threat model, but also be able to go in and implement them. And what's really tough with today's threat modeling exercises is that they are very manual and expensive. They're very inconsistent. They're insufficient in terms of providing guidance for developers. They're difficult to integrate, and they ultimately need to satisfy a number of different compliance measures. So maybe tackling the first one here in terms of being manual and expensive, it's really intense because when it comes to a lot of threat modeling exercises, it becomes really difficult to be able to do this at scale across an entire portfolio, primarily because a lot of threat models are done through some resources that are, very limited across an organization. And ultimately, in terms of threat modeling, it's typically done through whiteboard exercises, spreadsheets, and documents. And this manual nature just makes threat modeling something really difficult for a lot of organizations to be able to do, and definitely be able to do across the entire portfolio. What's tough with threat models is because it is so manual in nature, ultimately, as you have different engineers performing the threat models, you're going to have different inconsistencies. So, a threat that one individual might think of might not actually come up in another exercise, even though it might be within the same team or the same organization. And with that inconsistency, a lot of developers complain about moving goalposts and just not being able to understand what they need to do to be able to actually address the findings from a threat model. A lot of developers complain about not having clear, detailed instructions. With threat models, a lot of the threats that come out might be vague. They might be, just unclear as to what could actually happen and what developers actually need to do to be able to mitigate those specific threats that actually come up. And it's tough because oftentimes those threats might live in a Word doc or a spreadsheet that developers go back and reference, and it doesn't really work with their existing flow. So, if they're living in Jira or if they're living in GitLab or GitHub, they have to go to this other area to figure out what the threats are and then be able to mitigate them. And it's tough because sometimes developers will bring that content into Jira and GitHub, but again, that's going to be super manual in nature, where tickets are created as one-off. And all of this ultimately compounds in being able to have a really difficult time when it comes to compliance and privacy requirements. There are a whole host of new privacy regulations that have come out as of late with GDPR, CCPA. The various states are introducing new regulations, and across the world, there's a number of different regulations that are coming into play from a privacy perspective, and it's tough to be able to meet those privacy regulations and meet other compliance regulations like SOC 2, ISO 27001, and various others. And it's tough because a lot of these regulations require threat modeling, but it just is a very difficult endeavor. And moving on to the next slide here. So one of the ramifications ultimately, as we've chatted about, is, threat modeling is only done on a portion of the portfolio. It's not done on every single, asset that exists within the organization. And this ultimately creates a lot of loose ends and a lot of weaknesses that attackers can go in and exploit, as they actually, go in and attack your various environments. And what's tough is threat models themselves are typically only done once. They might be done at the start of the project, but as different iterations occur, those threat models are not always updated, and so the threat model itself might not actually be current relative to what the system actually looks like. It a lot of times, because threat models are so manual in nature, they just don't have that attention to be up to date all the time. And then ultimately, when it comes to the mitigations that are recommended from the threat models, whether you do that threat model internally or you might even have a third party come in to perform that threat model, it's tough to validate whether or not those mitigations have been done or even done properly. So oftentimes, developers might feel that they're actually mitigating something, but they're not. And so it's tough to close that loop to be able to validate that things are actually done appropriately. And all of this ultimately just comes up with unidentified and unaddressed risks, and that technical debt ultimately that the organization might have from mitigations that were recommended through threat models. That technical debt just grows and grows, and it's tough because what this ultimately does is it impacts the product quality. It could impact the organization's reputation and even financial results if a breach does occur. And definitely from a data privacy perspective, it's definitely horrendous. I think we all have lived through so many different data breaches. I was actually personally sitting in a hotel chain that was breached. And so when I woke up in that hotel chain, I was reading the news on my phone and realized that particular hotel chain was attacked and breached, and my information was out there in the public. And similarly, I was also flying on an airline that was attacked, and it was tough because the next day after the attack, the airline couldn't even trust whether or not my passport and my ID that I was presenting was actually valid because, although it matches what's in their system, is it actually truly that, or was it an attacker who actually went in and changed some of that data? So, there's a ton of data privacy risks and issues that come about, and it ultimately affects customers at the end of the day. Moving on to the next slide here. So SD Elements provides a breakthrough approach when it comes to threat modeling. Ultimately, what we want to do is really focus on being able to scale threat modeling across an entire organization. And we want to be able to mitigate risk and allow organizations to have a clear idea of how to achieve compliance measures, things like SOC 2, ISO 27001, and a whole host of other regulations that are out there. And ultimately, this is done through an automated format. So rather than having to rely on manual spreadsheets and documentation, we're going to walk through how threat modeling can be done within SD Elements in a much more automated fashion. And ultimately, what this allows you to do is be able to understand threats across your entire portfolio and then understand them at the various levels that exist as well. So, whether it is hardware, whether it's software, APIs, cloud technologies, and ultimately what this all results in is being able to obtain that compliance. And so those weaknesses are identified, relevant mitigations are identified, and all of this will be integrated in so the developers can actually see this guidance where they're going to be working. And this is one of the key elements around, or one of the key pieces to SD elements, I should say, is being able to integrate the security guidance into things like Jira, GitHub, GitLab, and ultimately serve up the mitigation guidelines where folks are actually going to be looking every single day. So rather than forcing your engineers to have to switch between screens, they can get that guidance that they need where they're looking every single day. And this results in in an approach that allows the agility and ultimately the velocity of your team to remain. So rather than, hindering the velocity by going through a very manual threat modeling exercise, ultimately through the automated approach that exists within SD Elements, you're able to maintain that velocity and meet some of the customer expectations when it comes to deadlines and dates that are set forth by your various products. And just moving on to the next slide here. And the way that this works within SD Elements, ultimately, when it comes to a lot of threat models, when they are done manually, ultimately you start with a blank page. And, I've been in the AppSec industry for quite a number of years. And, maybe after an hour, I can come up with, 20, 25 different threats that might exist within a particular application. But it's tough because you're starting from zero and kind of building up. Instead, what SD Elements does is ultimately we have a very expansive content library, and we're able to focus and filter that content to the appropriate items that are relevant for your particular project or your particular product. And it's just absolutely amazing going about that way rather than, adding things in and manually kind of coming up with these threats. What's beautiful about SD Elements is, our content library itself can be added to. So if you do have unique threats that exist within your specific organization or specific product areas, those can be brought up. And you could also talk about the various mitigations as well. And those could be served up not only for just one single application, but you can scale that guidance across your entire portfolio. In terms of really quick stats around SD Elements, we have 795 different items in terms of 795 different threats that exist within SD Elements today. And then there are 1,792 mitigations that exist in terms of tasks. And, in terms of those mitigations, we have a number of different how-to guidances, a number of different training modules, and additional requirements that are ultimately served up when required by a specific regulation or a specific aspect of your application. And so ultimately what this all results in is having, a whole lot of guidance that SD Elements is able to draw from, and it presents the actual requirements as appropriate for your specific product. And we're going to see how that works in a little bit here. But ultimately, I also do want to highlight that we have 697 training modules, and these are quick 1 minute, 2 minute videos that we'll see in a little bit. But with 697 different training modules and items, this allows SD Elements to really attack that problem that developers always complain about in terms of not knowing what to do and how to do it. And they're ultimately going to have some really cool videos to teach them about concepts within security as they're about to tackle them, not just once a year when they're required to take them. And yeah, so ultimately we have a lot of different guidelines, across IoT, across various cloud services. So whether you're using AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud, we ultimately have a lot of support there. We've got support for different containers, different web servers, lots of different databases. And you can kind of see here that we have a fairly expansive support for various languages. And, there's a whole host of compliances and regulations that are in play. And we have 78 of them in total that you can choose from and draw from to help with your threat modeling exercise and the output of your threat modeling exercise. So I'm just going to advance to the next slide here. And so we're going to see SD Elements in action. And as we're doing that, I just wanted to talk about the different scenarios that we're going to be looking at today. Oh, sorry. I think actually we're going to start with a poll question right before we get there. My apologies. So you'll see a poll just on your right here. And the poll question is what are your current challenges with threat modeling? Is there not enough expertise? Does it take too long? Is the output not actionable for software development teams? Does it not integrate with software development? Does it not tie into business value? And it's a choose all that apply. So we'll give the folks a few minutes, or sorry, just a few seconds here just to go in and respond. Perfect. And let's take a look at some of those results here. Awesome. Okay. So yeah, it seems like the number one answer is it doesn't integrate with software development. So this is definitely really huge. There's 67% percent of folks have mentioned the fact that ultimately threat modeling doesn't integrate with the SDLC and with the typical software development flows. And it ultimately being a out of band item that needs to be performed really decreases velocity and just really hinders software development itself. And then we do have our kind of next two answers are there's not enough expertise within the organization and it takes too long, as well as it doesn't tie back to business values. And we have 50% across the board there. So that's awesome to see. Perfect. And so moving on in towards the demo scenario. So just in a little bit here, we're going to dive right into the tool and we're going to take a look at some different areas within the product itself. But ultimately, what we want to showcase and highlight is through SD elements, you can rapidly identify weaknesses that threats target. And then based on those threats, you're able to provide mitigation to developers through an actionable format. And that actionable format is also going to be delivered into things like Jira, GitHub, and a whole host of other issue tracking tools that developers might be looking at on a day-to-day basis. And then the other big thing too is we do have the ability to validate whether or not mitigations have properly been implemented. We can import results from various SAST and DAST tools to be able to gain an understanding there. And also there are a number of test tasks that exist for the SD Elements guidance. So even if there isn't coverage from your SAST or DAST tool, we do have clear guidance in terms of how to validate whether or not a test task itself has been whether or not a particular test item has actually been performed. I think we do have a question. Raquel, did you want to read that out for quick
Yeah, for
second?
sure. So we got a question from the audience. Does SD Elements use elements from MITRE ATT&CK framework and Stride?
Yeah, so definitely great question and awesome. Yeah, so when it comes to the MITRE ATT&CK framework and Stride itself, we do take those into account. There are, a number of tasks where the guidance itself actually comes directly from the MITRE ATT&CK framework and various other MITRE resources that have been published. But rather than going through, forcing folks to go through that complex Stride threat model or, the complexities around following the MITRE ATT&CK framework, ultimately SD Elements tries to really simplify the threat modeling experience. And the idea here is, by doing that, you're able to actually get more folks within the organization involved within threat modeling. So rather than having to rely just on the security team or the compliance team to perform those threat models, you can start to tap into the PMs, lead developers, developers, solution architects, and even developers across your organization to perform the threat model. And so there are elements of Stride and the MITRE ATT&CK framework that come into play, but those aren't actually tapped into directly. So, oftentimes when it comes to both the MITRE ATT&CK framework and Stride, those are key elements that a lot of folks use within their manual threat model. But some of the complexities involved with both of those makes it really difficult to be able to scale that across an entire organization, across the entire portfolio. And so, yeah, hopefully that helps to answer your question. We definitely use the knowledge from both of those and various other threat modeling guidance that exists out there, as well as security mitigation. So as we saw in that content slide earlier, our team of librarians are fantastic, and they are able to glean knowledge from a whole host of different regulations, and they're able to glean those in as those regulations change. And similarly with languages, cloud frameworks, with different arenas within software development, the librarian team is able to stay on top of those changes and be able to present those appropriately for your developers to be able to understand and interpret. And the idea here, going back to that second point, providing actionable guidance, we want to be able to give developers, clear details in terms of what they need to do, and take away some of that ambiguity and take away some of that aspect within threat modeling that makes it really difficult to not only perform but also even on the tail end, once you have those recommendations, to be able to actually go in and take action rather than building up your technical debt. Hopefully that answers the question. Please let me know through the Q&A if that does, or if you have any other questions there. And yeah, the Q&A chat is open, so please jump in and ask away if you have anything that comes up. And then
Adhiran, sorry to cut you off. There's actually a follow-up from the same attendee. It's a question and a comment. The question here is, do you see that developers and DevOps even realize the task to mitigate threats? And then his comment is that they can't even get developers to consider using security test tools.
Yeah, no, that's really definitely really tough, like especially within organizations where security might not be a mandate, where it's really an afterthought, and it's bolted on, after the product itself has been built. It's tough, right? It's a very tough spot to be in, but ultimately through the guidance that SD Elements provides, that guidance can be delivered really early on, and being able to deliver that guidance into Jira and the other issue trackers, you're able to get that in front of developers as they're actually, planning their product changes, and upcoming releases. And ultimately through that, you have a bit of a fighting chance of getting folks to take some appropriate action, especially when it comes to running test tools and things like that. That might be a huge hindrance, like when it comes to the velocity of a development organization. But being able to provide them instead with some tasks that address some of those common threats that might exist might really help, and it might be an easier sell to make rather than forcing folks to scan. Oftentimes, when scans are done, they're done really late, and organizations are faced with this element of, do they actually fix some of those findings that come up within the scanners, or do they delay a specific launch to actually get a specific mitigation in place. And so, with the content that SD Elements provides, since it can be delivered early and brought into the typical development lifecycle, ultimately there is a bit of a fighting chance when it comes to security. And I definitely feel for you. I've been in that boat, trying to get development teams to take appropriate action, to produce and publish secure web apps and secure applications. It's definitely tough, but SD Elements will help you out there for sure. And yeah, so specifically, we're going to chat about building cloud applications, APIs, and microservices later today. And then we're also going to be talking about how to simplify complex regulations and compliance measures. So with that, I'm just going to take over the screen share here in a sec. Perfect. And so I wanted to start off with, the threat modeling manifesto itself. This is ultimately a format that a lot of organizations use to be able to, cut across various frameworks that exist. Whether you're using that MITRE ATT&CK framework or Stride, the threat modeling manifesto really helps break down threat modeling into its core elements. What are we working on? What can go wrong? And what are we going to do about it? And then finally, the validation step around, did we do a good enough job? And this is really tough to perform manually. Ultimately, when it comes to MITRE, MITRE actually recently created a playbook for threat modeling medical devices. And this playbook is over 50 pages of actionable content and then, another 40 plus pages of just sample exercises that exist. And this is just really tough and difficult for organizations to be able to consume and actually implement. And what's tough is, when it comes to this playbook itself, it is really mandated because, if your medical device is going up for FDA approval, you have to perform a threat model. So this isn't an optional task. It's something that needs to be done. So it becomes really tough and really complex. And this is where SD Elements can really shine and help you out to be able to make threat modeling much more automated and a lot more straightforward. So the way in which we do that within SD Elements is we start off with a survey. So this survey provides the ability to, going back to that manifesto itself, what are we working on? And so gaining that clear understanding of what are we working on, we're able to do that through that survey to better understand the various components and features and functionality of your application. We're going to dive into the different languages that might be being used, different web technologies, different database technologies, and diving deeper into some of those as well. What's cool about being able to capture the various languages is that we can actually provide some actionable code samples to developers to help them be able to mitigate some of those threats rather than having to go to Stack Overflow or Google or try and create some of those on their own. They can start with some guidance from SD Elements to help them out. And then similarly, when it comes to web technologies and database technologies, we have the ability to provide some configuration for developers. So again, that they're not forced to start from scratch. And then we can also gain an understanding of different compliance requirements and different measures to be able to better understand the application and where it's going to be used. And once that survey is complete, what we're going to do within SD Elements is actually classify that application. So this could be critical, high, medium, or low. And based on that, you're going to have an appropriate risk policy that's going to be applied. And this risk policy is really cool. This actually goes in and further filters the content. So we had that initial filter within the content through the survey. So again, since you're not starting with a blank page, but rather drawing in that content from SD Elements, through that survey, you can highlight the aspects that are actually appropriate. And then through the risk policy, you can further refine that. So, if there's a specific regulation that you're going after, or if there's a specific internal policy you're trying to meet, ultimately SD Elements really helps be able to address that and create that as a risk policy that could be met. And based on these two filters, ultimately there are two pieces of content that are created. The first are problems, and these are the various threats that exist. And so these are the things that could go wrong within your particular application. And with each of these problems or threats, ultimately there is a countermeasure or mitigation that exists. And these are called tasks within SD Elements. And these tasks ultimately provide developers that guidance around what they need to do to mitigate those threats. And these tasks are typically broken up into various phases within the SDLC itself. And these phases can be changed to be able to match your specific organization. But through these various phases, developers are able to, really understand what they need to do in action. And you can even actually segment these off. So potentially you might have an operations team that is configuring your AWS or GCP or Azure environment, or maybe even some of your databases and various other web servers. And so that action and those tasks that could actually be delivered to them, those could be delivered separately than what's actually pushed out to the developers. So if your ops team is using a different Jira environment, or if they're using even a different tool, you can support that and provide that guidance where the ops team is working, and then provide it separately for developers to take a look at for the items and tasks that they need to be able to go in action. And so for each of our tasks, we ultimately start with that problem, what could go wrong, and then we provide details around a solution. And the solution itself, is a really clear aspect around what the developers need to do. But for a lot of developers, this isn't enough. They need to know more. They need just a little bit more help to be able to figure out what's going on. And so we ultimately can start with some of our just-in-time training. And these just-in-time training items are quick 1 minute, 2 minute videos that really help deliver some additional guidance towards the developers as they're about to tackle some of those concepts. So potentially, if you are using JSON Web Tokens, then those developers can actually just learn more about what the JWTs are before they actually go in and take action and actually develop some of those. And we have a whole host of those different modules. We have almost 700 of them now, which is awesome. And these are taken from our Security Compass training courses and then just broken down from there. And this is just awesome guidance to be able to give to developers. But we don't stop there. We also provide a number of different how-tos. And as I mentioned, when it comes to development type tasks, this is typically delivered through a code sample. So being able to actually show developers, a sample piece of code that our team of librarians have created. So, there are no license implications with using this, changing it, modifying it, and ultimately, this just gives developers a huge leg up rather than having to start from scratch. They're able to get some guidance and, just a really clear idea of what needs to be done. And this is kind of really tough because even if your organization is able to implement some test tools, SAST and DAST tools, it's tough because a lot of times those tools tell you what's wrong, but they don't always tell you what needs to be done and what needs to be addressed. And this is where SD Elements can really come in and really help out and help organizations just provide a really clear picture for developers. So, it's not ambiguous and they don't feel like the goalposts are constantly moving on them. They have a really clear idea of what they need to do and be able to implement security. And this is, really tough for sure to do, right? Because security is unfortunately ever changing. So being able to have this guidance be updated to various language changes and various regulation changes, just really helps be able to get things done and be able to, maintain the velocity of development that your team might have. And again, as I mentioned, for the most part, folks will not be jumping into SD Elements to take a look at the content. They'll instead be consuming the content that SD Elements produces within Jira, GitHub, and various other issue trackers that exist. And ultimately, the guidance that gets pushed into these issue trackers are very actionable. So we're going to start with that solution. So what do developers need to do? And then what are the items that they need to actually accomplish? And so we'll deliver those code samples into Jira and those various other issue trackers. And we even have those just-in-time training modules as well available through your issue trackers. So as long as your organization is using single sign-on, there is no other screen to go through or anything like that. With the click of a button, developers can learn more and be able to consume that training that they might need to be able to address a specific task at hand. And similarly, there's a whole host of different issue trackers that we support and provide that guidance through. And when it comes in towards some of the operations tasks, this is where we ultimately have how-tos that are much more around a configuration perspective. So what are the steps that your operations team needs to take to be able to mitigate a specific item? So, disabling unnecessary SQL Server protocols, here's a really quick way in order to be able to do that and be able to address that security concern and be able to help create a much better security posture for your organization without having to dig through a whole host of different documentation. And then, in terms of not using default ports, again, same idea when it comes to those operations type tasks, those deployment tasks. We provide clear deployment guidelines in terms of what needs to be done. And then we'll also provide some how-tos in a whole host of different languages and different areas as well. And again, those how-tos are just really amazing for developers to be able to use and action and be able to address what's actually going on. And ultimately these tasks really help out, but the tasks themselves don't have to be limited to what exists within SD Elements. If you do have some specific process tasks that your organization might embark upon, based on the threat model that exists, you could actually bring those process tasks to the surface and be able to allow your team to deliver them. So, folks aren't really confused about what needs to be done. Especially as your development team grows and changes, with turnover and everything like that, with the whole great resignation that's happening these days. Ultimately, being able to provide that guidance in a very systematic mechanism allows your organization to really ensure that security is being addressed and met. And you could track whether or not these tasks are actually being done, right? So because these are going to be delivered into Jira and those other issue tracking systems through a bidirectional sync, we can capture whether or not those tasks have actually been completed. And then you can report against that as well. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But one of the cool things too is you can go in and verify that things are being done. So if you do have that SAST or DAST tool within your organization, we have support for a number of different tools like Veracode, Checkmarks, and Fortify. To be able to draw in the actual results from those tools and be able to glean whether or not a specific item has actually been addressed. So maybe a developer has marked a specific task as complete within Jira, but once your Veracode scan goes in and runs against it, you can learn that actually that task hasn't been addressed. And there might be specific areas where there are concern. And so that task could be marked as incomplete and sent back into that developer's Jira, Azure DevOps, GitLab, or GitHub environment to be addressed. And then similarly, some organizations might actually use this verification data to be able to take away some of the tasks. So rather than inundating your developers with tasks that have already been completed, if your security tools like Veracode are able to verify that, hey, you know what, there aren't any cryptographically secure numbers that are not random being used, you can actually mark that task off as complete, and you don't have to surface that up in Jira for your developers to take a look at. And ultimately, that guidance itself that's going to be delivered into Jira is appropriate and relevant. And you're able to take in some of that data from your test tools. But that doesn't always exist. There is going to be gaps with every single test tool that exists out there. And this is where our test tasks really come into play. And so for the tasks that we took a look at a little bit earlier, there is a test task related to it, which provides just clear guidelines in terms of how to actually validate that something has actually been done. And we do also offer some how-tos within Burp Suite and Exploit Me. So if you are using either Burp Suite or Exploit Me, you can use this guidance to actually perform your test. So even if your organization doesn't have a test tool, you can still, encourage some of your team to go in and perform some of these test tasks, or, as a security team, you can perform some of these test tasks as well to validate that things are being done. And this exists for all the tasks that I went through earlier. So whether it is some of those operations type tasks or those development type tasks, we do have test guidelines ultimately to validate what's going on. So jumping in, one of the big things that a lot of folks are working on is, either moving towards the cloud, or potentially your organization might be building some cloud native applications. And within SD Elements, we have a whole host of guidance to be able to help you out with this. And we're able to really understand what's going on within your specific environment and provide the appropriate guidance. So within this deployment section of the survey, we're going to ask, what particular cloud tool is going to be used, and then which services are being leveraged. And so whether that's Azure, GCP, or AWS, we can capture that data. And this might seem cumbersome, like in terms of, forcing folks to actually go through that survey every single time. And we have a really cool solution for this. And this is in the format of application profiles And ultimately, what these profiles are a quick look at some of the common things that are being done within your organization. And there's a whole host of them that come in out of the box, but customers typically will create their own profiles. And these profiles ultimately are just a set of survey answers. So rather than forcing folks to go through each of these items one by one, using the appropriate profile, these could be pre-selected so that they could really just focus on some of the deltas and some of the changes that might be being done within that specific service or that specific product or feature enhancement. And this is just really cool because it allows folks to be able to really, provide that data without making it cumbersome and difficult. And then, as I kind of chatted about, ultimately, there's a whole host of different tasks that are related towards cloud environments and being able to secure your cloud environment. And so this is, really clear in terms of some of the solutions that need to be applied. And then, of course, our how-tos just dive right into specific settings within Azure, Google Cloud, and AWS to help you learn more and be able to actually implement what's been called for through the threat model in terms of a mitigation. And in terms of some of our tasks themselves, we are driving in towards a story-driven task to be able to ultimately reduce the amount of content that's actually pushed out. Unfortunately, when it comes to operations teams, they have, just so much guidance to go through and so much, documentation that they have to deal with. And through additional requirements, this is where we can actually really focus and fine tune some of that guidance so that they only get the information that's actually relevant to them. So these are additional requirements that are ultimately dynamically brought in to the solution text itself. So, as someone from your ops team or potentially even for a development task, as some of your developers are looking at that content within Jira, it's just going to appear as, that single item, but this content can be dynamically brought in. So if, for example, you are trying to meet a specific regulation, there might be some items that you need to do to be able to meet that regulation within a task. And so that guidance can be surfaced when it's necessary rather than having to surface it up all the time. And this just allows the task itself to be really clear and really crisp in terms of what folks need to do. And similarly, when it comes to those how-tos as well, the same idea exists. So we have the ability to really configure which how-tos are actually surfaced. So you don't have to necessarily surface all of them. And these how-tos, again, really just jump in towards how to actually configure your specific item within, whether it's AWS, GCP, or Azure, and you're able to just learn more about what needs to be done and addressed. And of course, there are also test tasks that also exist for these. So you can actually validate whether or not the configuration has been done appropriately. And if it's not, then you have really just clear guidelines in terms of what needs to be what needs to be changed and what needs to be addressed from that perspective itself. And jumping in, when it comes in towards some of these tasks themselves, potentially whether it's a cloud environment or maybe even if you are developing a microservice or an API, you might just have some specific changes that occur. And within SD Elements, you don't have to go through that project survey every single time. When you do have a release, you can actually just do that release survey, which just looks at what's changing. And so are there any major things that are changing from a security perspective based on your specific sprint or a specific project that's coming up? So maybe you are going to be changing aspects of the authentication. And so through this, ultimately, what we can do is just surface the appropriate tasks that are relevant just for that change being addressed. So rather than having to surface all of the content that might exist within the project, you can really focus on the things that you might need to validate for a specific project or release that's coming up. And that's the same whether you're maybe changing your cloud environment or whether you're changing your application itself. When it comes to microservices and APIs, ultimately a lot of organizations are creating these, and these are really difficult to threat model. They're really difficult to threat model primarily because you don't always know how an API or microservice is actually going to be leveraged or used. Once it goes out into the wild, since it is ultimately a expandable unit, you have other developers that can come in and do things that might not have been initially anticipated. And this is where obviously that project survey itself does live on, and it is dynamic, and it allows you to be able to come back into SD elements to capture some of those changes that exist. But also what's kind of really cool is you could actually do these project surveys based on what actually might be changing, right? So say, for example, you are implementing a project that's going to be using, specific APIs and microservices that exist, but you're going to be maybe changing the authentication flow relative to how those APIs and microservices intended. And so you could go in and do that release around authentication and just capture those appropriate tasks, rather than having to surface everything up and go through all of that data. But definitely from an SD Elements perspective, we're going to be able to gain a really clear understanding of your API and your microservice, and then be able to produce some content for you to be able to action and address from a security perspective. And when it comes to microservices and APIs, these not only change all the time, but the actual release cycles for these are just getting shorter and shorter. And a traditional threat model just does not work well for these, right? If you do go through that manual threat model, it's just really difficult to keep up to date and be able to change, as things change within your microservice. But what's kind of really cool is, like, through SD Elements, again, because we have the ability to deliver some of those code samples based on the language that you're using. If you do have different languages across your different microservices or APIs, we can support those, right? And we can actually provide that guidance to the appropriate team. And what's cool is, especially when it comes in towards your web servers, in terms of being able to properly configure those. So whether that might be something like an SSL hardening, we could do that across different web servers that exist. And so, if you're using a, Node application that's deployed into Nginx, or if you're using a Java app that's actually going to be deployed, on towards Tomcat, you can actually capture those different items and be able to understand what needs to be addressed and what needs to be pushed out. And so I guess we're going to get to our just last thing here, and our one more thing. And this is, the output of all of this. After you do all of this amazing work, when it comes to performing your threat model and performing all of these exercises, then, what do you do with this data? And within SD Elements, what we can do is we can build risk policies based off of specific regulations and compliance measures, and you can see where you're sitting from an application perspective relative to those different regulations and guidelines. And so you can actually glean that information from a Azure DevOps, Jenkins, or other build tools as well. And you can actually just go back to the application and really ultimately query it to see where you were sitting from a risk policy perspective. And so you can ultimately block a build from deploying out towards production until it meets the risk policy, so that you can ensure that things like GDPR or your SOC compliance is actually being met and addressed. And ultimately, when it comes to that risk policy, as I kind of mentioned, what this does is it really just filters all of the content that exists within SD Elements and really fine tunes it to only the tasks that are relevant to be able to address that specific compliance measure or maybe an internal policy that exists. And what's kind of really cool is you can actually report against this as well. So, when it comes to creating, a report, maybe a SOC 2 report might be a really good one to start off with. This could take your organization weeks, months to be able to produce. And within a matter of seconds, as you're working with SD Elements and working with the tasks within Jira and your various other issue trackers, you're going to glean that data around whether or not tasks have actually been completed through that bidirectional sync that exists within SD Elements. And then you can create a SOC 2 report to see where some of your gaps are. So our reports obviously talk about what the regulation is, but then we go in and we break down the regulation, section by section, and we're able to bring in the appropriate tasks and obviously the status of those tasks. For an auditor that might be coming in to take a look at your particular environment, or even for internal folks that want to be able to see, where your gaps are from maybe like a SOC 2 perspective or other regulations. This is really awesome. And, these requirements, whether that's SOC 2, ISO, PCI, potentially if you are selling into the federal environment, we do have a whole host of support for things like FedRAMP, lots of NIST compliance measures. So NIST 853 is a huge one that comes into play. And ultimately, you can get a clear understanding of where that gap is and where that delta is. And this allows you to be able to access brand new markets. So rather than, being stuck where, your sales team might not be able to access different customers or even the federal environment itself, being able to see how you're faring relative to some of those compliance measures just really gives you a huge leg up. And this ultimately, to some extent, comes for free as you're actually working with the tasks within your issue trackers. And so it's really cool and just really awesome. And these reports are obviously generated in a matter of seconds, and there's a whole host of different arenas that we support for this. So it really helps your organization really be able to bring in security across the board and be able to ultimately make security not a bolted on feature, but make it something that folks think about right off the bat. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think we have one more poll question right before we jump into the Q&A here. And so the poll question that we have up here is, who asks for threat models within your organization? And this is, again, a choose all that apply. Is it your legal team, your security team, your privacy and compliance or GRC team, or is it senior leadership or potentially even your customers that are requesting threat models? So we'll just give folks a few seconds here to jump in and answer. All right, let's take a look at those results. So it looks like, yeah, 80% of the folks in the call here say that the security team are the ones that are mandating the threat modeling exercise itself. And then there's 40% of folks that are saying that the privacy compliance or GRC team is the one that's actually mandating the threat model. So that's really cool to see and really cool. And ultimately, through SD Elements, of course, we do provide that ability to scale that threat model across the entire portfolio. I think it's definitely every security team and privacy team's dream to be able to have an understanding across the entire portfolio. And it's just really difficult, unfortunately, but definitely through SD Elements that can be achieved. So I think with that, let's jump in towards the Q&A here. Raquel, do we have any questions?
We do, yes. So we have a question that came in from the audience, and this may have been answered already, but I'm going to ask it just in case. Can tasks be integrated / tracked in your SAST or DAST tools? This would provide confirmation that a task was completed.
Yeah, so there isn't a way to actually import the SD Elements data in towards a SAST and DAST tool. It works kind of just the other way, like in terms of we're able to capture that data from the SAST and DAST tool. I guess the key nuance there is that there needs to be a mapping that exists. And from an SD Elements perspective, we maintain a map for a whole host of different tools like Veracode, Checkmarks, and Fortify. But unfortunately, when it comes to those tools, they don't have a map of SD Elements tasks that they maintain and take a look at. So there isn't a way to import SD Elements data into your SAST or DAS tool or into other environments that might be capturing some of that data, like maybe a thread fix or even like a Kenna security environment. So I just want to call that out. Yeah.
Perfect. We have a couple more questions, but just quickly before we do that, we have one more poll that we wanted to put up. It's just a discovery poll, so you can answer if you wish. But while we do that, we'll get to the next question. Do developers need to use another tool?
Yeah, so this is the beauty of it. Developers don't need to use another tool at all. So they can really just focus on using Jira, GitHub, GitLab, the issue tracker that they're going to be looking at daily to take a look at what bugs exist and then also what features they need to implement. Ultimately, this is the tool that they're going to be using on a daily basis, and SD Elements integrates with that tool to be able to deliver the guidance that they need in a very actionable format. So yeah, developers aren't going to have to jump into yet another tool. So you don't have to deal with that whole struggle of trying to get adoption for another tool. Developers can just kind of focus in on the issue tracker that they're using on a daily basis, and this content is going to be delivered there for them. When it comes to that survey that is performed, typically it might be a lead developer, a solution architect, a product manager. Someone from the team typically does do that survey to be able to figure out what content needs to be delivered to the developers. But most developers don't have to jump into SD Elements. They just take a look at those tasks within their issue tracker.
Perfect. Another question we have here is, how does SD Elements tell us about new threats?
Yeah, this is really cool. So when it comes to new threats that emerge and new items, ultimately, what happens is within SD Elements, we have this actual magical blue button that pops up within SD Elements around there's new content available, and that can actually allow a product team to actually figure out whether or not they want to include that in their current sprint, or maybe they want to bring that some of those new threats and those appropriate mitigations into an upcoming sprint. And through that magical blue button, ultimately you can deliver, brand new items. So even if you say, for example, through one of your bug bounty or some of your other public reporting mechanisms, you learn something about a particular microservice, a particular API, a particular product, you're able to take that knowledge and apply it across the board through SD Elements by creating a new problem and task within SD Elements. You can apply that across that board to all of your various APIs, all your various microservices and various products that exist out there. And so, yeah, it's really an awesome approach that exists within SD Elements. And in terms of having to, sift through new threats and new data that exists, that's something that our librarians do. And so you don't necessarily have to have that expertise in-house. And this is really beneficial. In our earlier poll, we saw that one of the biggest drawbacks to performing threat models is the expertise. And, of course, maintaining those threat models, one of the big drawbacks to maintaining that over the time is not having the expertise in-house to be able to manually do those threat models. And so by relying on SD Elements' librarian team, you can get knowledge about new threats that emerge and get those directly delivered to developers in Jira and other issue trackers as appropriate. And also even as regulations change, right? So as regulations have new things that crop up, those could also be delivered again back to developers in their issue tracker.
Awesome. And just to make sure that we stay on time, we have a few questions that came in, but we will make sure we answer them. We'll respond back to you via email once this webinar wraps. But in terms of next steps, if you are interested in speaking with the Security Compass Solutions engineer, please do visit our website to contact us today. Also, when the webinar closes, you will be taken to our SD Elements content library just so you can learn a bit more. Once again, thank you so much to our speakers as well to our audience for joining us and engaging with today's webinar. For any upcoming events and webinars, please do check out the resources section of our website. So that brings a close to our webinar today. Please stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day.